This Thursday edition of Locked On Grizzlies, we are talking Jaren Jackson Jr., reviewing his season, things that looked well or worked well, things that didn't work as well, what we hope Jaren will be working on in the offseason ahead, the pros and cons of 2023-2024 for Jaren Jackson Jr. That's the focus of this episode of Locked On Grizzlies. Let's lock in, shall we?
You are Locked On Grizzlies, your daily Memphis Grizzlies podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Thursday edition of Locked On Grizzlies, and I am so thankful, so grateful to have you with me. Yes, me. It is I, Joe Mullinax, flying solo on this episode of Locked On Grizzlies, talking to you about Jaren Jackson Jr. on today's episode. Tomorrow, DeMichael Cole will be flying solo, talking to you about Desmond Bane, but we're going to give the big man his due in a season that he was arguably the MVP of the Memphis Grizzlies. In a gap year, lost season, however you want to phrase it, I will be discussing Jaren Jackson Jr. on today's episode of Locked On Grizzlies. But first, this episode of Locked On Grizzlies is brought to you by Monopoly Go. Game off. We have got to talk more about Monopoly Go. This fast-paced game lets you team up with friends for tournaments to unlock awesome prizes, unique stickers for trading, for example, cool playing pieces, and hilarious emojis that you can taunt your friends with. Download Monopoly Go now on Google Play for free or on the App Store. Game on. We are free and available wherever you get podcasts as wonderful members of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team each and every day. Like, comment, rate, review, subscribe, whatever the case might be, however you get your podcast, make sure you are checking out Locked On Grizzlies. Make us a part of your NBA content consumption, your Memphis Grizzlies content consumption each and every day, each and every time an episode drops. So I'm excited to be with you on this episode of Locked On Grizzlies to talk about, I don't know why you would say arguably, in my opinion, he is the MVP of this season for the Memphis Grizzlies, and that is Jaren Jackson Jr. And if you remember correctly, if you are an everydayer and you think back to a prior episode of the show, DeMichael Cole and I had a conversation about this, and he said that Ja Morant was his MVP for the obvious reason that he was the most important player, most valuable player to winning when the Grizzlies were on the floor. We talked a lot about Ja yesterday, not going to go too far further down that hole talking about Ja Morant's season. Clearly, he was most important to winning, but this season was not about winning, right? And you can make the argument that it wasn't about winning starting from the very beginning due to the 25-game Ja Morant suspension. And that's the first thing that I want to credit Jaren with on this episode, because we'll talk about areas where he struggled and things that we want to see him improve on. But again, we're going to lead off with positives. And my biggest positive for Jaren, you've heard me say it time and again here on Locked On Grizzlies, sometimes the greatest ability is availability. And Jaren Jackson Jr. provided that for the Memphis Grizzlies this season. He played in 66 games, the second most of his career, the third straight season in which he played at least 60 games. So it's good to have that availability for Jaren. But the thing in terms of availability, even beyond games played, which obviously is important for the end of season awards and Jaren Jackson Jr. being eligible for the all-defense team. DeMichael Cole, my partner, mentioned how he voted for Jaren for second-team all-defense. That's phenomenal. Very happy to hear that. Beyond that, those accolades and awards, Jaren Jackson Jr., even though he played in 12 less games, logged almost the exact same amount of minutes as he did in that 2021-2022 season. The first year the Grizzlies were the 2 seed in the Western Conference in this current iteration. 2,126 minutes were logged by Jaren across 78 games. 2,124 minutes 2 years later were logged by Jaren across 12 less games. So what does that tell us? The foul troubles that plagued Jaren in the past have faded to an extent. They are nowhere as much of an issue as they have been previously. You can use per 100 possession numbers, and I'm doing this through Basketball Reference for those of you that are curious. Per 100 possessions, his rookie season, Jaren Jackson Jr., 7.2 fouls. That's a massive number. A couple seasons later, 7.8 in the 2020-2021 season. That was only 11 games played. It was a small sample size. This, despite the minutes being bigger per game than they've ever been, Jaren per 100 possessions only had 5.4 personal fouls. Now, there's reasons for this, right? There's reasons for this. Jaren prioritizing the offensive end in the absence of Desmond Bane for a chunk of the season, in the absence of John Morant for a larger chunk of the season. Jaren Jackson Jr. was the number one offensive option, and his defense suffered for it. We'll talk more about that later. But his offensive numbers growing, just in terms of sheer scoring, in terms of his isolation game improving, so much of that coincides and connects with his ability to just be on the floor. So beyond injuries, beyond suspensions, beyond all of that, the first thing I want to prioritize with Jaren is the availability as a leader to the organization, and also the leadership ability to understand an area in his game that he needed growth. The team needed him on the floor. He wasn't perfect. He still committed fouls, maybe when he shouldn't have committed fouls, but it was definitely improved. And that growth is something in this leap year that you want to see, even from a guy in Jaren Jackson Jr., who, despite his age, just completed his 6th NBA season, which is wild to say out loud. Jaren Jackson Jr., not that old. Ladies and gentlemen, not that old at all. He is 24 years old as of now. He will be 25 on opening night, but he just finished his 6th NBA season. A young basketball player, to say the least. We've talked a lot about his isolation scoring, in addition to him just being able to be on the floor more, being that steadying hand, that constant presence for a Grizzlies team that needed that this year more than they have in some time. Beyond that, seeing what he did in terms of acknowledging what he is capable of, the confidence that came from his Defensive Player of the Year nod, and how it was applied on the offensive end. This is a young man who took advantage of the opportunity that came his way. John Morant is out. Even when Bane started the season, and the Grizzlies started the season, 6-19? Not a good record by any stretch of the imagination. But it could have been a heck of a lot worse if you didn't have Jaren Jackson Jr. out there scoring the basketball. The way that this season plodded along in the wake of the John Morant shoulder injury, it could have been a heck of a lot worse if you didn't have Jaren Jackson Jr. showing that growth, not just as a facilitator, not just as a creator off the dribble, but an acknowledger of his size and strength and ability to take advantage of mismatches. Because that had not happened before, at least not consistently. Whether Jaren's playing the 5, playing the 4, that was a topic for a recent episode of Locked On Grizzlies. Again, we're not going to go back down that road. But I want to reiterate, regardless of the position, if you're a fan of positionless basketball, or if you're still a traditionalist, when Jaren has somebody that is undersized, he has to take them to the paint. And when Jaren is dealing with somebody that is slower than him, he has to be able to take them off the dribble. And when Jaren is able to come off of a screen or play some pick and roll actions and have an open 3, even though he needs to get better in that area, and we'll talk more about that, that needs to be a priority too. And he showed all those different levels, all those tools in the old toolkit, all those different pieces of the bag, so to speak. He became a more complete player in 2023 and 2024, partly out of necessity, partly because he had to. The Memphis Grizzlies needed him to be that guy, but he was physically there. He was healthy enough to be that guy, to carry that burden. He had the capacity in terms of his skill set to grow as a passer, which is going to be so important going into next season, assuming this team is healthy. The ability for Jaren to create for others off the dribble in those isolation situations. Again, he's not Nikola Jokic, but the growth that he displayed, a career best year in assist percentage, that is going to pay dividends down the road. When we talk about this gap year, we talk a lot about G.G. Jackson. We talk a lot about Vince Williams Jr., how their arrival, right, their discovery, however you want to phrase it, that's going to help the Grizzlies so much. I would argue that what Jaren Jackson Jr. found this year is going to help even more. Because no disrespect to G.G. Jackson and Vince Williams Jr., those guys aren't going to be the difference between this Grizzlies team making the playoffs or making the NBA Finals. Guys like Jaren Jackson Jr. are going to be those difference makers. And as Jaren has less offensive responsibility and hopefully can redirect some of that energy back to defense, which we'll talk more about here in a moment, as that comes to pass, the lessons and the skills that he learned and developed respectfully in this season should also be there for the Grizzlies to enjoy, not just Jaren. So kudos to Jaren on that availability, on the leadership he displayed, and the growth in his game, specifically offensively. When we come back here on Locked On Grizzlies, we're going to talk about areas he needs to get better. And nobody's immune to that, like we talked about with Ja. All the different players we're going to review in this series. Not a hater. Jaren's an extremely important piece of this team. There's still room for growth. We're talking about an example of that coming up next here on Locked On Grizzlies. But first, this episode of Locked On Grizzlies is brought to you by Game Time. I'm a huge fan of Game Time, an authorized ticket marketplace of the NBA, making getting playoff tickets even faster and easier. Prices on the Game Time app actually go down the closer it gets to tip-off. That is one heck of an app to use. You got to look through it, checking out all these different games coming up, any other high-profile event that might be on your radar. You can use Game Time to find last-minute tickets through flash deals and zone deals. And it's not just playoff hoops or hockey. You can also find Major League Baseball tickets for any kind of event in your area, but even beyond that. With great views from any seat in the venue, that helps you make a conscious and wise purchase beyond just hoping that you got a good spot. Save even more, up to 60% buying last minute for sports, concerts, comedy, theater, etc. with those last minute deals. And again, the lowest price guarantee for Game Time means that they will credit you 110% of the difference if there is a lower price than theirs. Take the guesswork out of buying NBA tickets with Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use the code LOCKEDONNBA for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account and redeem the code LOCKEDONNBA for $20 off. Download Game Time today. Last minute tickets, lowest price guaranteed. Big fan of Game Time. You should be too. When we come back here on Locked On Grizzlies, things Jaren Jackson Jr. can get better at. Stick with us. Welcome back to Locked On Grizzlies. I am Joe Mullinax, flying solo on this season review episode of Locked On Grizzlies, talking about Jaren Jackson Jr. Again, my partner, DeMichael Cole, of the Commercial Appeal there in Memphis, Tennessee. He will fly solo on the Friday show, talking about Desmond Bane. I'm taking on the big. I focused on the big responsibility Jaren carried this year. The guy from the big three of Ja Morant, Desmond Bane, and Jaren that played the most games, logged almost as many minutes as he has in a regular season, despite playing 12 less games. He was on the floor more, committing less fouls, doing more things offensively. That's all phenomenal. Unfortunately, it was at the expense of his defensive acumen. And while I do think DeMichael nominating him to the second team all defense is deserved, it's fringe. It's fringe because the reality is this. Jaren Jackson Jr. was not able to be the dominant defensive force that he had been the previous year because he had to carry so much of that offensive burden. And we have to remember, I'm guilty of this. I'm sure you are as well, dear listener, dear viewer. These guys are human beings. Right? They're not robots. They're not people that you go beep, boop, boop, and you charge them higher. And okay, now you're a two-way player. You need to be the defensive player of the year and score a career high in points. That's not how this works. And that's never really been Jaren's game. Jaren has been his best when he has defensively been able to play off as a true four. That's never really been an issue in the past. They've had Jonas Valanciunas, then they had Steven Adams. In the absence of both those guys, Jaren didn't really have the opportunity. He had to be a center most of the time this year in Memphis. And again, regardless of how you feel in the overall debate, the reality of Jaren is he statistically has done better things individually as a power forward. Now, as a team, you can make an argument that Jaren is better suited at the center. And that's what Jaren played 99%, according to basketballreference.com, of his minutes. 99%. That's easily the most of his career. Maybe this, Donovan Clingan, Andre Drummond, maybe we're overthinking this. Maybe we just need to trust the Grizzlies and assume they see Jaren as their center. That would offset one of the other concerns that I have for Jaren to an extent, and that is his three-point shooting. DeMichael talked about it on the show yesterday. Jaren struggled mightily from three this year. 32%, not great. He shot 35.5% last year. That's better. Unfortunately, he has only had three of his 6 seasons where he shot over 35%. And only one of those seasons, as DeMichael alluded to yesterday, his second year in the league, did he shoot dominant 39% from beyond the arc. So what does all this mean? This means that regardless of where Jaren plays, whether he's a 4 or a 5, he needs to be a bigger threat from three-point line. The Memphis Grizzlies, as DeMichael pointed out, and I agree with him 100%, if you're going to start John Morant, which obviously they are, and if you're going to rely on a guy like a Marcus Smart potentially, which the Grizzlies clearly may, you need more spacing around these guys. You need the ability to shoot threes. You can't just kick that to the curb. That's not a realistic way to do this moving forward. If you're going to compete at the highest level of the NBA, you need some three-point threat. That's why Luke Kennard being a popular name for people to trade makes no sense to me. You've got a top 10 shooter of all time on your roster. Maybe you should just play that guy more as opposed to moving on from him. But I digress. The reality is Jaren Jackson Jr. for this offense to truly evolve when everybody's out there together. Because Jaren will still get isolation scoring opportunities. They're just not going to be as plentiful with the high usage Morant, the high usage Bane being back in the fold. When was Gigi Jackson his most successful this year? In high usage situations. If Jaren's playing the 5 and Gigi's playing the 4 in an offensive style lineup, sounds good in theory, but Gigi has to be able to rely on Jaren to provide spacing for him on the perimeter. And just chucking threes, despite what people may tell you about volume, chucking threes is not the best way to create that spacing. People are not going to respect you long term. Maybe if you're Luke Kennard, for example, and you're going through a cold stretch, maybe people will still respect you because of the history of your ability to make those shots in the past. But being a 31 or 32% shooter and chucking threes, you're never going to be able to convince me that that is something that's a positive for any offense. I've watched too much grit and grind Grizzlies basketball to know that that is indeed not the case. So for Jaren, a return to defensive form should theoretically come about with a return of health to the Grizzlies and whatever they decide to do at the center position, because they're going to acquire a big. We've heard Zach Kleiman say that. He has been very clear. He was very clear at Breakdown Day last month. The Grizzlies somehow are going to bring in a big. Are they going to draft one? Maybe. Are they going to sign one in free agency with a mid-level exception? Maybe. Are they going to trade for one? Maybe. But there is going to be a change in the roster in some way, shape, or form where a big man is brought in. Doesn't have to be a starting big if they truly think Jaren can be the 5. He can be someone who eats 20 minutes off the bench. But however they address that issue, it is going to provide Jaren with an opportunity, more than likely, at least more of one than he got this past season, to play the power forward, maybe more in line with the 2022-2023 numbers, where it was like a 75-25 split for Jaren playing the center versus playing power forward. That would enable him to play more defense. That would enable him to put himself in a position as a weak side help defender to protect the rim and right the wrongs of some of his perimeter brethren, like a John Morant or a Desmond Bane. That is where we've seen him have the most success defensively. And I want to see them get back to that. Because in all reality, what is more likely for the Memphis Grizzlies? Them becoming a top 5 defensive team in the NBA next season, given their personnel? Or them becoming a top 10 offense in terms of three-point shooting? I would say the former is the most likely scenario. So, yeah, you want three-point shooting. You want to see Jaren continue to grow and develop and get better at that. But for me, for this offseason, I need to see more of him in a position, whether he's playing the 5 and he has to get more comfortable defending in that role, there has to be a return to that elite defender. It doesn't have to be Defensive Player of the Year. But we're talking about him in the first team conversation as opposed to the second or being a fringe member of that team. A return to that kind of form as the Grizzlies regain their health is going to be huge for Memphis in terms of title contention. When we come back here on Locked On Grizzlies, we're going to finish out this episode, things we want to see him work on beyond the defense, because a lot of that's dependent on the health of the team, right? So what can he work on in the gym, in the lab, so to speak, to get better over the coming summer? We'll talk about that next here on Locked On Grizzlies. But first, are you tired of watching ESPN and Fox Sports all day long, having to turn down the volume with all the shouting? Make the switch to Locked On Sports today. It is a free 24/7 streaming channel programmed for you every day to bring you the biggest stories without all the screaming. Locked On Sports Today brings you can't-miss analysis, opinions, and news, streaming 24/7 on YouTube and the free Amazon Fire TV channels app. It's part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team each and every single day. Make sure you're checking them out. This episode of Locked On Grizzlies is brought to you by Monopoly Go. Yeah, I'm a big fan of Monopoly Go. You should be too. We're going to pause to talk about Monopoly Go. And again, we've already talked about Monopoly Go. We've brought them up a lot. There's just so much good stuff going on in the game. I think it's really important that we take some time to shout them out. You can build up a team with your friends for time tournaments in Monopoly Go, working together to build up each other's boards. The more you win together, the more awesome prizes you can unlock, like unique stickers, cool new playing pieces, and then even hilarious emojis that are perfect for taunting your friends, whether you're smashing their buildings or heisting their vaults. Plus, Monopoly Go feels new and exciting every day. There's constantly changing tournaments and challenges, a ton of unique mini games, again, a robot pachinko machine, digging for treasure, and always new ways and timed events to help you win big, like massive multipliers for everything you win or even rent frenzies. There's always something fun to discover in Monopoly Go, so get off the bench, go download it now for free on Google Play or on the App Store. Monopoly Go, game on. When we come back here on Locked On Grizzlies, closing out the show with things we want to see Jaren work on in the gym this offseason. Stick with us. Welcome back to Locked On Grizzlies. I am Joe Mullinax, once again flying solo. DeMichael Cole will take you guys home for the week. He'll have the Friday edition of the podcast talking Desmond Bane. I've been talking Jaren Jackson Jr., the good, his availability, the way that he's grown as a scorer in the isolation opportunities, foul troubles not being as big of a thing as they were in the past. Also talked about some things I want to see him get better at. 3-point shooting is important. Even more than that, a return to form defensively. Hopefully a lot of that improves just because he won't be the number one option offensively anymore. He'll be number 2, even number 3, depending on who he's on the court alongside. That leads us to what we want to see Jaren actually work on, right? And I'm not just going to repeat myself and say 3-point shooting. I want to see Jaren recommit to rebounding because given all the minutes that he played and all those sorts of things, per 100 possessions, Jaren had been averaging double-digit rebounds over the last couple of seasons. He dropped all the way back down to 8.4. That's the lowest it has been since 2019, 2020. And that's disappointing because so many of his minutes, as we talked about according to basketballreference.com, came at the center position. So while I am not going to be a rebounding truther like some of our commenters on YouTube, some folks on X, and I'm going to say Jaren can't play because he can't rebound, I'm not going to be that guy. But I do need to see a return to that double-digit number, because that matters in terms of per 100 possessions. If your big is not a threat to grab boards, what are we talking about? And again, he doesn't have to be Nikola Jokic. He doesn't have to be Joel Embiid. He doesn't have to be Jonas Valanciunas or Steven Adams. But he needs to be somebody that can be down on the block, around the paint, using that 6'11" frame to clean the glass a little bit better. And there's drills you can do for that. There's work that you can do. I'd love to see reports and hear things, beyond Jaren, going between the legs with a dribble and dunking. I want to see him working on the glass. I want to see videos of him getting down and dirty and physical down in the paint. Not because he should become a low post big. I've said time and again, you don't want to make somebody something that they're not. Jaren Jackson Jr. is never going to be Steven Adams or Jonas Valanciunas, but what can Jaren Jackson Jr. be? An 11.4-ish total rebounds per game, big man for the Memphis Grizzlies per 100 possessions. How do I know he can be that? Because he's been it before. So a refocusing on getting to that level of rebounder. Again, that's a very basic number, right? That's average. Go from being a below average rebounder, which he's been much of his career, to get closer to average rebounder and see how that helps the Grizzlies in terms of extra possessions offensively and limiting possessions for the opponents defensively. I want to see Jaren work on his rebounding this offseason and continuing to develop his body in that way. And this is going to sound kind of nitpicky to close out our episode of Locked On Grizzlies here. But Jaren had a really good season. He was the MVP of the Grizzlies for a reason this past year, in my opinion. There's only so much that you can kind of pick and prod at, right? But I'm going to pick and I'm going to prod. I have asked for Jaren Jackson Jr. to be a better creator of offense for others in terms of assist percentage for years. And Jaren listened. I think he's a big fan of Locked On Grizzlies. At least he must be, because his assist percentage this past season was 13.1%. 13.1%. That was above average for bigs. And that also almost doubled his career high of 7.2. Almost doubled his career high in assist percentage. That's phenomenal. Phenomenal work. Very happy with that. And again, that's going to pay dividends down the road. However, turnover percentage, 10.6%. The worst since his sophomore year. Or his sophomore year in the NBA, I should stress. And that is with a career high in usage of 30.4. Now, again, some of this is going to get better simply because he's not going to be asked to do a lot of the things that he had to do this season. But we want him to retain the lessons here. We want him to keep the things that he developed in this gap year. It's not just Gigi Jackson or Vince Williams Jr. It's not just Jake LaRavia potentially being an end of NBA roster player all of a sudden after a strong last month of the year. What Jaren Jackson Jr. is doing has direct consequences and connections to what the Memphis Grizzlies want to be. And with Ja Morant and Desmond Bane back on the floor, especially Ja Morant has to be more of a scoring threat. They can't just write him off because of his lack of a three-point shot, opponents, that is. They can't just put him aside and say, let him, go under screens on Ja. And then it's only a pick and roll situation. The newfound growth and the newfound aptitude for Jaren as a creator of offense for others in terms of the passing game, that has to stick around. That has to be a thing that results in Ja Morant backdoor cuts and lob alley-oops. That has to be a thing that results, much like it used to do with Steven Adams a couple of years ago, in Desmond Bane slashes to the rim, that kind of passing rapport. And you need to see that not just with the two stars, but with a GG, with a Vince Williams Jr., with a Marcus Smart, a Brandon Clark. Jaren has shown enough in terms of his handle and his ability to create for others in terms of assist percentage. I'm fine with a Brandon Clark, Jaren Jackson Jr. pick and roll combination. Find mismatches. The guy is a walking mismatch. And to Jaren's credit, he has put himself in a position as a creator of offense for himself and others that he has to be respected in that way. Otherwise, he is going to pick teams apart, especially when better talent is surrounding him. So keep that energy. Work on that handle. Continue to develop those passes and those decision-making processes. Lower that turnover rate as that usage rate goes down, especially. Keep that assist percentage near that number. And again, in the absence of elite shooting outside of Luke Kennard and Desmond Bane, but Bane had a down year three-point shooting. I have a feeling DeMichael might talk about that a little bit tomorrow. In the absence of elite three-point shooting that the Grizzlies are probably not going to be able to acquire, you have to find ways to diversify your offense and get creative. Jaren, as a pick-and-roll creator, is a pretty creative idea, at least in my opinion, and I'd love to see more of that moving forward. Let me know what you want to see down below in the comments. I'm guessing a lot of you will agree with me on the rebounding. And again, I don't need him to be Valanciunas. I don't need him to be Steven Adams. I need him to be what he was the last few seasons. This year was a pretty big departure from that production. And I also want to see him creating as Ja and Bane get back for those guys and not losing the assist percentage work and the facilitation work that he put in. When we are together next on Locked On Grizzlies, it'll be the Friday edition of the show. DeMichael Cole will be flying solo for that episode, talking to you about Desmond Bane, all the good things that Des did this year, stuff that he needs to get better at, things that didn't go as well. We'll close out this version of our player reviews on Friday with Desmond Bane, and we'll pick back up next week. Thank you guys so much for being with me wherever you're checking out Locked On Grizzlies. It is much appreciated. Like, comment, rate, review, subscribe, whatever the case might be. Make sure you're checking us out on YouTube, Apple, Spotify, Amazon, literally anywhere you get your podcasts. Subscribe, smash that subscribe button. Make Locked On Grizzlies a part of your NBA and Memphis Grizzlies content consumption each and every day. We're proud members of Locked On Podcast Grizzly, or Locked On Podcast Network here on Locked On Grizzlies. We are so thankful for our sponsors, so thankful for Locked On Sports Today, the first 24/7 streaming channel on YouTube. Make sure you're going and checking that out. And most importantly, dear listener, dear viewer, we appreciate you. Make sure you're back hanging out with DeMichael to talk Desmond Bane on our Friday edition of the show. I'll catch you guys next week. Until next time, shout out Jaren Jackson Jr., the MVP of the 2023-2024 Memphis Grizzlies. We'll catch you next time here on Locked On Grizzlies.